All right, welcome everyone to yet another very special episode of the Mike Sennello Show. Tonight we'll be conducting our final interview in my series of interviews with the candidates for local elected office here in New Milford for the 2021 election cycle. Tonight we will be interviewing Board of Finance Chairman Walter O'Connor. As we always do with all of our live interviews, we conclude our interviews with your audience Q&A. So if you've got questions for Walter, this is your final opportunity to get direct access to these candidates and to challenge these candidates with whatever tough questions you might have for them. So if you've got questions, get them in. When they come to you, just pump them into the comment section. That way you don't forget, and we will get to your questions at the end of the interview. That's true for everyone watching at home on YouTube. That's true for everyone watching at home on Facebook. And as I've mentioned, we are dual broadcasting. We are simulcasting onto Facebook and YouTube. So if you'd prefer to watch on YouTube, link is in this video's description. If you'd prefer to watch on Facebook, link is in this video's description. The last thing we've got coming up is that on Sunday night, I'll be doing a recap of all these interviews and a wrap up of the election cycle before we go into before we have our election day on Tuesday, November the 2nd. If you're planning on voting, I highly recommend voting in person, as it is the most secure way to vote. And that's really all we've got left on the schedule until the big day comes. So, as I've mentioned, tonight we're wrapping up our interview series with Board of Finance Chairman Walter O'Connor. And with that completely all out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in tonight's guest. Walter, thanks so much for coming on.
Good evening, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Walter, as we always do, how can people reach and follow you?
Well, I'm on Facebook just personally, and I'll give out my email. I don't have a campaign site or anything like that. On my personal email, all lowercase, it's walterorn@gmail.com.
Super. And with that started, let's get into our interview. Walter, as I've mentioned 100 times so far in this series, the way I like to do these interviews is to get to know the person a little bit before we get to know the candidates. So we start everybody off with the same question. Walter, what brought you to New Milford?
Well, I first became aware of New Milford is actually my uncle had a Montgomery Ward store on Railroad Street back in the 70s, and then he moved it over to where the current Housatonic Brewery is now. I am a registered nurse, and I started working in New Milford Hospital in the 80s and eventually built a house here in the early 90s. My wife also worked here in New Milford, so that's what gravitated me to live here in town.
Oh, all right. So it's been quite some time then that you might I ask where you moved from?
Prior to New Milford, I was in New Fairfield.
Okay.
Originally from Mount Vernon, New York, and we had a summer home in Putnam Lake, which is right across the border from New Fairfield in New York.
All right. And then what was the biggest attraction as far as moving to New Milford?
A convenience, and my kids were out of just graduating high school. I had three of them. They all graduated from New Fairfield high schools, and we wanted to downsize a little bit. So we built a house here in town.
So then after the girls move away or go off to college, you move into New Milford. What's the story then of you moving from just resident of New Milford to someone who's involved in local government and local politics? What was your attraction initially?
Well, I always wanted to give back on things. It's in my nature. Going back to 2012, I believe it was, Joanne Chapin was the chairman of the board of the finance, or chairman of the board of finance. I worked closely with Joanne. Joanne at the time was president of the nurses union in the hospital. That's where I worked. I was a previous president of that organization. She knew I had a degree in finance or business, I should say. And she asked me to become an alternate. Pat Murphy then interviewed me, as well as the RTC. And I became an alternate in 2012, and I ran for the office the first time in 2013, re-elected in 2017, and now we're here in 2021, going for my third term.
So just so folks know, Walter, this is not the only board or commission you've volunteered for. You want to talk about some of those other boards and commissions you've volunteered for here with New Milford?
Well, basically, the main one that they've been on with regard to the town is I'm the vice chair of the pension committee here in town that oversees the municipal pensions and the like. With regard to New Milford Hospital, while it was still New Milford Hospital, I was on two board of directors subcommittee. One was the Quality Steering Council that overlooked all the quality measures in the hospital, and the other one was the foundation's investment and pension committee that oversaw all those finances.
Okay. This is a commission that I've brought up quite a few times, and I think it's really influenced the nature of the Board of Finance and how it's evolved over the last few years, and that's the Charter Revision Commission. I've kind of beaten this to death. Walter, you didn't actually serve on the CRC, on the Charter Revision Commission, but you just want to inform the viewers, talk about your role in that whole process.
Well, actually, the first role is Mayor Bass asked for a representative for the Board of Finance, and I recommended Joe DiGregorio, who then became onto the commission. Whenever the commission was discussing items that impacted the Board of Finance, I attended and gave my opinion and the like on it. We've had quite a few dialogues going back and forth with the members of that commission.
Okay, so what was then the specific expertise they relied on you for?
Actually, just a hands-on of the Board of Finance and what we felt, or what I felt, needed to be changed in the charter. I'll give you an example. The ability of the Director of Finance to invest town funds without the approval of any body, I should say. And that was one of the things that was changed there. There has to be approval of Board of Finance on making investments.
On any investments, or was there a threshold there?
There was a couple of thresholds. One was the financial director could make investments without our approval as long as they're less than 1 year duration. So if you wanted to make a 6-month deposit, CD in a bank or something like that, you didn't have to roll one over. You didn't have to come to us for permission. Anything over that maturity date, then he had to come to us and discuss it. There is, and I always mix up, 1/8 of a mil, 1/5 of a mil, that has to come to us, or under a certain dollar amount that can go through without permission for the Board of Finance and Town Council, and that got changed to more restrictive measures.
More restrictive, as in the threshold before Board of Finance intervention was reduced.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so it was a previously more than whatever it was, and now it's a smaller number. So
yeah, there's more oversight. Let me put it this way.
Okay. So we've mentioned a number of the Charter Revision Commission recommendations, which were eventually approved at the referendum. We talked about how that's affected budget development, the budget development process. We've talked tonight about some of those thresholds for oversight. Is there anything that you'd like to highlight that either was missed or that you think was just really important to discuss as it relates to the Board of Finance especially?
You mean currently, or back with the charter revision? With
the charter revision, was there anything that was, say, missed?
Well, yeah, one of the things we discussed a lot was for the Board of Finance up to the line item veto in the budgetary process, like the Town Council does, and that was not approved by the Commission. They kept it the same in terms of the broad categories we could make adjustments in. For example, we could adjust personnel, but we can't go in and say, take away one police officer. We could, the whole broad category of personnel, we could reduce the dollar amount or increase the dollar amounts. The other change that came about with the charter is if a vote on the budget, the bifurcation of the budget was one. The other is if either fails, instead of going to the Town Council, which was what the old charter was, comes back to the Board of Finance for adjustments, then goes back out for another vote with the, for the electorate, the referendum.
That final revision you just talked about, how if a budget fails at referendum, it goes back to the Board of Finance now instead of the Town Council. Did you agree with that revision recommendation?
Oh, yes, without a doubt, I agreed with that recommendation. Um, and I just an add on to that, though, the town council can accept the recommendation for recommendation on a failed budget, but they only have, I think it's 48 hours, and it has to have a 2/3 so to
Right.
override the Board of
That way,
Finance. So
if
there
you
is a
get a
check
board,
and balance there.
yeah. That way,
Yeah.
if you have a
Whereas
board of finance that
before,
runs off the rails, you can have the
yeah,
town council jump in real quick and
yeah, and before that, there was no check and balances between the two. Um, an example would be the last budget that failed was the time of the storm,
Mhm.
the tornado and stuff like that.
Yep.
That was before the charter revision, um, or at least the vote on the charter revision. It went back to town council. They made some adjustments and in fact raised the mill rate from what the budget originally went. That budget failed again. They
Mhm.
went to a third budget, reworked it, and again raised the mill rate. So I think the going back to the Board of Finance first, and then having the check and balance there is really an improvement for the town as opposed before where there was no check and balance on a failed budget.
So is it just
Other than the voters themselves?
okay? Is there some special expertise that, say, the Board of Finance might have that, say, the town council might not have, that is informing your agreement with that decision, or is it strictly for the purposes of having a specific check and balance set up?
Well, it's both. You want a check and balance set up. A lot of the current members of the Board of Finance have been on here for a number of years. The term of office on the Board of Finance is 4 years as opposed to 2 on the town council, and it's also staggered.
Mhm.
So not all the Board of Finance is up for a vote at one time. So that gives a continuity and a historical perspective of the members of the Board of Finance. Like I said, for myself, I've been on there since 2013. Dr. Larry Tripp is on even longer than that. Barbara Wolf has been on. She was first elected with I was in 2013. The rest of the board, it's been less than that. So, I mean, a greater number of the board, almost half the board's been there for at least a decade.
Yeah. So the last thing on the Charter Revision Commission, because like I said, in this interview series, we've kind of beaten this to death, and you're the chair of the Board of Finance, so I really want to get more into the specifics of the Board of Finance. Mayor Pete talked about bringing the Charter Revision Commission back together quite a bit more often than the legal minimum, which is every 10 years. He actually threw out the idea of 3, 4, or 5 years to have a revision commission put together, even if the recommendation is to not change anything. Since you were so involved in the last Charter Revision Commission, is this something you'd consider serving on, say, the next time around?
Serving on or have influence onto, if there's a Board of Finance member there, if it's not for me, go on it. I would like to have for lack of a better term, authority to appoint a member from the Board of Finance to have some continuity there.
Well, nominate, and then I would assume the council
exactly
would have
correct.
to approve, that nomination.
Yes, all that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into the Board of Finance in general, because we've had 3 candidates on so far for the Board of Finance and 2 members. One is a seated member, one is an alternate. And we'll have to get into that. Let's just get right into that so we avoid confusion moving forward. Walter, can you discuss the difference between the various seats on the Board of Finance?
Well, a seated member is someone that's been elected to that position. Okay. An alternate is someone that's been appointed and approved by the mayor and then approved by town council to be an alternate. The alternates can take part in the meeting as a seated member if a seated member is absent. So if a seated person, number A, is not there, I can put one of the alternates seated for that meeting. The way I run the Board of Finance, so all the alternates have the ability to sit and discuss along with the Board of Finance any of the issues, but they don't have any voting. Only the seated members can vote on any particular issue.
How do you go about your seating? So when somebody's absent, how do you decide who gets to sit?
Well, a lot of that goes by state regulation. Right now, the Board of Finance has 7 members and 3 alternates. Whichever party has the majority on the board gets two alternates, and then by state law, the minority party or unaffiliated party gets the third seat. A Republican, for example, a Republican alternate can only take the place of a Republican person that's absent. If it's a 1-for-1. If it's a Democrat, then I have to go to the minority representative that needs to be put in. If there's more than one, then you could start seating, I could potentially seat two Republicans if the Independent or Democratic Party isn't there, presuming the Republicans have majority, which they do now.
Is there any weirdness that comes about if there are actual third-party candidates on these boards and on the board itself?
They would be part of the minority representation.
So, majority, for example, if you had, let's say, 5, you said there's 7 seated elected and seated members. So let's
correct.
say 4 of them are Republican, 2 of them are Democrat, and 1 is Green Party. So if the Green Party member is not there, how would you fill that seat?
That would have to go either to the non-Republican, in your example, alternate. It has to go, if it's a minority seat, it has to go either to the minority alternate that's there. If the alternate is not there, okay, but I have a quorum without that seat being filled, I don't have to seat somebody.
Okay. So just so everybody understands how all of that works, because the Board of Finance doesn't operate in that manner, the same way that, say, the Town Council does. So it's good to have the chair on to explain all of that for everybody. So with that said now, especially after the charter revisions that we talked about, what do you see as the proper role of the Board of Finance?
Well, it has 2 main functions. First is a fiduciary one of overlooking all the financial records of the town. We get that presented to us on a monthly basis by the Director of Finance. The other is the budgetary. Obviously, the budgetary participation in the budgetary things in the town. If you want, I can go through all that, taking a budget from beginning to end if you want, the whole approval process. But that's
why don't we save that, because I've got some notes here on the budget. We have a section. I have a section in my notes reserved for the budget. So we'll put a pin in that and come back.
Okay, no problem.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so you did mention the fiduciary responsibility. I think you are actually the first one to mention that fiduciary responsibility when it comes to the role of the Board of Finance. What do you think how would you describe then the proper relationship with, I'm going to name 3 bodies: the Town Council, the Board of Education, and the Director of Finance?
All right, the Director of Finance and I are quite close. That's Greg Ossipro. He's been there for a number of years. I meet at least monthly with him, sometimes weekly, or I should say bi-monthly, sometimes weekly. And we just go over just what's going on, what's coming forward, what potential interest rates are, what we're going to do with, the funds that are maturing and roll over. So there is this discussions on, on that way. With regard to the council, there's not a lot of interchange between the Board of Finance and the council. Since we're both check and balances on each other, we talk to each other, but we don't caucus together. We don't collude together. They do their thing, we do our thing. Their Town Council does its thing, Board of Finance does its thing. There's a little bit of separation there. The mayor and I, we talk frequently. It's the same thing as with the Director of Finance, going back and forth on what's happening. With the Board of Education, I talk with the chair of the Board of Education, Wendy, quite a bit, since that's 2/3 of the budget, that taxpayers approve. Try to keep an idea and handle on what's going on there. Personally, I'm on the Board of Education has a strategic planning committee for the future. They call it the 2034 project. what a kid in kindergarten now needs when he graduates from high school. So I'm on that study group. Yeah, so we go back, and that would be the relationships. We need to have good communication, but we don't have collusion. Let me put it that way. This way, when we come to a difficulty or we come to the budgetary seats, we know each other. We know each other, and we could talk a little bit more about what needs to be done, what can be done, what can't be done, and the like.
So as far as the on the books and legal, say like oversight role of the Board of Finance with those three bodies, could you just talk briefly about what purview the Board of Finance has in those regards, where the line begins and ends with that? Okay.
The simplest one is the Board of Education, because that's bifurcated by the state. But all we could do, and the council is the same way with regard to Board of Education, is adjust their total budgetary amount.
Okay,
in other words,
so
if they want $50 million, we could go to 49, 49 or raise it to 51. The only thing is, by state law, unless certain very onerous conditions exist, you cannot reduce the Board of Education's budget from the previous year. It's called required minimum budgeting. So if last year's budget was 50 million, we could do 50 million, but we couldn't do 49. We'd have to keep it at least 50. The town council, after the mayor presents his budget, the town council and the Board of Finance have joint meetings, or joint meeting that goes over six to 7 days, where we interview the department heads of the budgetary, and we ask them why they want the X, Y, and Z in their budget and what their requests are. In that joint meeting, we also had the Board of Education representatives come there, and they present why they need whatever dollar amount they ask for and why they should have it. And there's a Q&A going back and forth between all the members of the town council and Board of Finance with those department heads and the Board of Ed.
So then we've gotten that relationship down with all these other boards and commissions. Well, at least the three that attract the greatest attention when it comes to the Board of Finance. As far as how the meetings themselves run, because I know you guys don't get much in the way of attendance usually from the audience. Describe how the meetings usually run. What do things look like in the E. Paul Martin when they take place?
Well, it really depends on what the town council is doing. If the town council has passed things that need our approval or discussion, oversight on, that goes on. That's what makes up the bulk of our agenda. On a monthly basis, the Director of Finance presents the current status of the finances of the town of New Milford, collections of taxes or income, and what's been spent out, and what the relationship is between those two numbers. Other than that, those are the two main items. And there's sometimes the only thing on the agenda is the Director of Finance's report. Other times we could have several pieces that we need to talk about and give a yay or nay to, depending on what the council has done. With regard to the budget, which is the one that's most likely attended, is after budget is determined by the town council, it comes to us, and we, have our adjustments plus or minus. We have our own discussions on it and make a determination of that. Once a budget is passed or adopted by the Board of Finance, it goes to referendum. If it's passed by the town, by the electors, that budget then comes back to the Board of Finance, and we set the mill rate appropriate to that budget.
And that reflects a percentage, basically, of taxation.
That's the bulk. The bulk of town income is taxation. There's also
the mill rate. The mill rate, you used a term called the mill rate. That's essentially, effectively, the property tax rate.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. Correct. I was going to say there's other streams of income, but they're not subject to voter approval or disapproval.
So we've talked about the Board of Finance as a board. Now let's talk about the role of the chair, since you're currently sitting in that seat. What do you think? What is the role of the chairman?
Well, one is to run the meeting. That's the obvious thing like that. I try to keep discussions fair, giving everybody an opportunity to discuss their positions, on there. Um, yeah, basically that's it on the routine meetings. Um, it gets a little bit more complex when we're doing the budget deliberations, and making adjustments on that. But basically, that's it. Making sure everybody has the ability to discuss it, have freedom, don't restrict the discussion or anything unless it's not germane to the topic. But other than that, yeah, no, that's basically it. It's a very simple board because of the nature of it. It's all about one topic, finance, as opposed to the town council, which is the legislative body. They could have, multiple things they have to discuss in one evening, whereas we're sort of restricted to what the council's already approved.
Yes. Okay. So your meetings usually run a little bit shorter than, say, the town council.
Yeah, I would say the majority of the time our meetings are about a half hour.
Okay.
Occasionally it's longer if we get a presentation. Um, Sometimes if there's a big project coming along that eventually needs the Board of Finance approval, we'll get a presentation on why the town wants to do this, what's the advantage of the town doing it. Like the lease we're having with ESG on capital improvements in order to save energy. We had a couple of meetings on that and presentations on that. That's just an example. Other than that, it's fairly routine. We're there within about a half hour. And again, it depends on if there's a lot of public comment before. We allow time for public commentary on most items or most meetings. The only meeting we don't is when we do our budget deliberations, because before that, the Board of Finance runs a town hall. That's several, multiple hours long. Sometimes they have more than one town hall where we have the input from any member of the town or anybody.
Where the only item on the agenda is public comment.
Yes, exactly correct. And then, and the reason I don't allow public comment on the time we're doing budget deliberations is I don't want to have another 60, 70, 80 people wanting to comment it before we have our deliberations. We've already given opportunity for that. And usually on those town halls, we get, if the budget coming out of the town council is controversial, we'll get anywhere from 100 to 200 people. I've had that many in attendance. If it's not controversial, I've had it as little 10 or 15 people. So it really depends, on what's happening during the budget process before that.
So we talked about the role of the chair. Now, the chair is actually a seated member, and
yes, correct.
It's not an ex officio seat like the mayor has when it comes to the town council. So, what is the actual and primary difference between the generic members of the Board of Finance and the chair?
Actually, none. Other than the chair is elected to that position, runs that position, and I have more interface with the other branches of the town government and the mayor than other members of the board. But they're welcome to talk with the director of finance, as they feel they need to, and the like, outside the board meetings.
So you said the chair is elected. How is who the chairperson is? How is the chair decided once the members of the board are elected?
At a meeting, there's nominations for who to be the chair, and it's if there's only one nomination, that's typically what happens. If there's two, then there's a vote, and whoever has the most votes becomes the chair.
And the nomination comes from the board itself.
Yes. Yeah. For example, I was nominated after Pete Bass was first elected. Before that, the chair was
Gail Alexander.
Yes, exactly, Dale Alexander. Before that, it was Joanne Chapin. So it does change over the years, mostly depending on the election and the makeup of the board.
So I think one of the other responsibilities that we haven't talked about when it comes to the chair, I feel like that there is at least a moral obligation for effectively introducing the new members who've never served to how the board operates. So what is your approach to the relationship between the chair and, say, the new members when it comes to, acculturating them to the board?
Typically, people that become an elected member, the vast majority of them have served as alternates before that. So they have a basic knowledge of how the board works. When they first become an alternate, I sit down, I talk with them, I explain what's going on, and encourage them to ask questions and learn about how it's going on. I've also in the past have had a few brief words with candidates that haven't served as that, and I obviously expand that once they become an elected board member. I'll sit down and talk with them, 10, 15 minutes explaining how the board works, if they have any questions, and the like. So it's not a sink or swim sort of thing. I try to get them, they have some basic understanding of the working of it and what the goals are, what we try to do.
So I just want to wrap up the generic questions about the Board of Finance before we move on to our more specific topics here. So the board, I've asked this question so far of every candidate that's come on to the Board of Finance, and we've had quite a few, almost all of them. The Board of Finance is the only board or commission I can think of that has an academic course of study in its title. So should candidates for the Board of Finance should candidates for the Board of Finance have a special acumen in the field of finance? And on top of that, separately, should the chair have a special acumen in the world of finance?
Well, if everybody that's seated on the Board of Finance has some acumen, that automatically gives the chairman some acumen, since he comes out of that. And that could either be by degrees, educational degrees and the like. It could be from life experiences. We've had business leaders, people that are entrepreneurs, had their own business there, so they have an understanding of finance. We've had people that have served in other governmental positions in different towns. Diane Clafe would be an example. I know you interviewed her. Mm-hmm. That had extensive background in that. Other people, in business, corporate life, depending on what they do, they have an idea of financing, they interact with it and stuff like that. So yeah, they need a basic understanding of financing, but they don't need, like I have a
credential.
I have a master's degree from the Ansell School of Business, from Western Connecticut University.
Okay, then.
Pardon?
Okay, then that's quite the credential if you're going to credential someone.
And but I think I'm the only one that has that type of degree, on a graduate level. I think one of the past members have had business degrees on an undergraduate level. So, there's some degree of background that's needed to act effectively on the board. Because the first time I was on the board as an alternate, it took me almost a year, and I've had good background in finance to understand the flow and what's happening and the like. Because, you meet once a month. So it takes a while to get acclimated to everything. So yes, it is helpful if people have those types of background and acumens.
But it's not necessary. So correct me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, but it seems to me like you said, there needs to be a threshold, a floor, but that floor can be met a variety of different ways.
That's correct, but it's not an absolute floor.
Okay.
Because it's
not a hard line. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a hard line because I have no control who the candidates are from any party. So it's up to the parties that determine who they want on the board, whether they have the ability to serve.
Okay.
And it's up to the voters to make that decision, ultimately, of course.
Well, you're a voter. How would you decide if, say, somebody who came on and had absolutely no experience in the world of finance and no financial acumen?
It would make a difficult vote for me, no matter what party the person's on.
Okay. So we've talked about the board in general. I've said this too on all of my interviews so far. The board, generally speaking, it's not really easy to know what issues you're going to run into in any election cycle. So it's tough to harp on any specific issue. The board, generally speaking, like town council, handles these issues ad hoc. When a problem comes up, you solve it. And then it's not like there's some 10, 20-year issue that, going into an election cycle is going to take that entire tenure and then some to resolve, or will be an issue for multiple years, with one exception, and that is the budget. which you know you're going to run into every single year. And we're going to get to that in just a minute because there is actually one thing that you guys are dealing with right now. And you guys are probably going to continue to deal with at least for several months. And that's the ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And before we get into the specifics on this, I think this was something that you brought up at the last meeting, that the Board of Finance has no legal oversight authority over this particular spending. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
No, I think that's a mischaracterization of what I meant. We can't change what the council has passed. We can say yay or nay, which then sends it back. If we say nay, it sends it back to the council. So it's not an exact. In other words, I'll give you. It's not line item. We can't do anything with line item. If they present us with 10 things for ARPA, we say as a group, we say yay or nay to that group, and we'll make recommendations. So far, it's always been yay. We don't have any qualms with what's been done so far.
Do you think that process could use some revision, or is that process, as far as the limited oversight you guys have over the specifics there, would you prefer the Board of Finance have more oversight in that matter?
No, because it's basically the same oversight we have for any spending.
So
that the town council does.
Right. So it's oversight over classes of spending rather than line items.
Correct.
Okay. So we talked about the Charter Revision Commission. I'm sure you're aware of how that actually functioned. And some of the things that they were deciding on, they decided not to make as recommendations because in order to get the recommendations passed at referendum, the voters can only vote on the totality of the package, right? They can't say, well, we like those recommendations, so we're going to vote at referendum for that one, but not that one. So there were some things that the Charter Revision Commission said we're not really confident about, and there's some things that really have to get passed at referendum. So maybe at the next charter revision, for now we're recommending what we're recommending, and there are some things maybe that we'd be in favor of, but they're kind of contentious, so we'll wait on that just for a minute. I wonder if you kind of agree with that approach generally to the ARPA funds. This is something I actually discussed. I think it was actually just earlier this week with our previous interview with Robin. Man, would you prefer to have the voters at referendum vote on the whole package or these bundles that are coming out periodically?
That's a question I haven't given much thought to, Michael, but I'll go off the top of my head. I prefer doing it in bundles, just personal opinion, because that's a lot of A, money. B, there's could be a lot of projects that are deserving of getting funded. And I would hate to see the risk of them not getting funded because, the whole thing gets, yay or nay on a whole big package like that. I think I'd rather see it in bundle. Secondly, on bundling, it gives us more opportunity to talk in specifics. It's, like we just got roughly 10 items with the town council, a couple of weeks ago, maybe more than 10, between 10 and 20. I don't remember the exact number.
I think it was about 12, yeah.
Yeah. And we were able to talk with the mayor a little bit about them all and what's going on. If we got 150 of them from the town council at once, it doesn't give us an opportunity to really talk about them, unless you spread it out over several months, and that defeats the purpose of the ARPA funds.
So the argument in favor of having the voters at referendum vote on the whole package would be that it forces the Board of Finance, I guess, and more importantly, the town council to only send those things to referendum that they're absolutely certain the voters will adopt. It kind of puts an onus on them to only focus on the things that aren't contentious, that are definite, spend the money, and we're not going to have any problems. I mean, do you agree with that rationale, or is that rationale something either you disagree with or is counterbalanced by something else?
This is akin to budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
We really don't know what the voters are going to say, one way or the other. Depends on turnout. Depends on a lot of factors. I agree to if we're talking about the charter, if you don't want that charter revision to be defeated, because then there's another certain number of years before you can revisit it. So in that sense, you want to make the important changes that you feel are the most necessary, the needs, not necessarily the wants, or that might be controversial. For example, line item veto of the Board of Finance in the budgetary process. That was one of the things that was discussed. They decided to leave that out. I think that goes to the history back to the 1990s, early 2000 with I think it was George McLaughlin was the chair of the board at the time, and budget failed after failed after failed. And, he ran it with an iron fist without regard, I only have to say it this way. I feel it's the role of the Board of Finance and the chairman, the way the charter is struggled now, is to get a vote on the budget that passes on the first referendum. And that's what the goal is. That gives all sides of the equation, nobody gets everything they want,
Yeah.
no one, everyone's to support it. So I try to do it so that the budget passes on the first go around. And the 4 budgets that I've been responsible sending to the town, to the voters, have all passed. So
On the
not
first
everybody was
referendum.
happy about all of them, but
Yeah.
some people were, some people weren't. And that's the nature of the beast.
So speaking to the ARPA funds, as we kind of wrapping up this topic, are there any, again, we've beaten this to death, so I'm really only touching up on these sort of things, but are there any items that are being discussed when it comes to the ARPA funds that you would not vote in support of, say if the Board of Finance could have some sort of line item discretion?
Well, that would come up in discussion. I haven't seen anything yet that I would say, gee, that's terrible. We shouldn't be spending that money there. As long as, the funding meets the requirements of the ARPA bill, and it's gone through the mayor and the council and, whatever subcommittees or whatever things they've had to do that. It's not really our role to say no. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
We can, but that would have to be a very controversial item to say no to.
Yeah.
And then it'd have to be overweight the whole package if it comes in a bundle like a 10 or 12 things. We could say no to it, send it back to the council, and the council could send us right back to us again. There's realities between oversight and the ability to change things. And with regard to the spending or the movement of money around outside the budget, the Board of Finance is really just a yay or nay type of a situation, and it's hard to get down to specific items, line items with that type of setup.
So you guys have some experience with how the town's funding is distributed, things like the contingency funds, landfill settlements funds, undesignated funds. So when it comes to the ARPA funds, there's really the only thing where there's been any contention whatsoever, and it was only for a brief moment, is on the repair of this dam. So do you think that the ARPA funds are the most appropriate way to repair the dam, assuming that it's been kind of universal that everyone wants to repair it rather than to dismantle it?
Yeah, I saw that at the council. You've got to look at it a couple of different ways. It does qualify for ARPA funding through the guidelines there. So that's a moot point. It definitely qualifies. So the question is, what other funding you could do? I don't necessarily think it qualifies under the landfill management based on the criteria. I'd have to study that a little bit more, but I would be averse, even if it qualifies, to do that. Using undesignated funds and other funds that the town has. Again, I would be averse to using that.
Would you prefer bonding over those funds?
No.
Okay.
No. If we had the ARPA funds to do it, I would rather not bond it. Reason is we've got bonding coming forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that projects that need to be bonded. We're doing the roads in a sequence, for example. That's going to take 10 to 15 years with bonding on each segment, which is why we just did the last 10 million bonding, or roughly $10 million. I think 970,000 or something like that, earmarked for the road project. When you're dealing with projects that last a long time, you want to bond it. And I realize the reservoir will last a long time when it's repaired. But if we can have the funds available that don't decrease the balances of other funds, like the ARPA funds, I would use the ARPA funds. That would be my recommendation to do that.
Is this a time value of money argument?
Part of it is yes,
Okay.
because if you bond it, you're paying more.
Mhm.
And luckily, interest rates are very low. We have an excellent bond rating. Part of the reason we have an excellent bond rating is because of the funds we have that you mentioned have such a good balance. If we start spending those down, it's going to affect our bond ratings and increase interest rates going forward. The other thing is we have to the unfunded contingency. We have to maintain a certain balance in there, which goes up every year. It's a 1.5 to 2.5 month budget costs that have to be kept in reserve. So if you start spending those down, somewhere along the line you have to replace it. The only way to replace it is to increase taxes. If you got the capital now to be able to spend it, it's a better way to do it for the taxpayer.
So it was brought up at the previous town council meeting too, in regards to the spending of this money on the dam, just in general, that the undesignated fund has I think it's tens of millions of dollars in it, and the contingency
19
fund,
and change, I think it is the last I looked.
yeah. So the contingency fund, however, has only a few $100,000 in it, and it may not be self-evident what the funds are there for just by their title. So, is this something that concerns you? What's the difference between the undesignated and contingency fund, and why is there so much of a difference in balance between the two?
Well, the contingency fund is basically used for what the title says, contingency. Something comes up that's out of budget, you use that as a way funds to go for supplemental appropriation. The unfunded, the designated, that's the fund that needs to meet those 1.5, 2.5 months of spending. So if you got $100 million plus budget, you're talking $14 to $20 million that needs to be in that fund. Okay. As that budget goes up every year, whatever if it does go up every year, typically it comes pretty close to going up every year. Those funds also have to go up. And the sources of those funds are surpluses. So if you start spending them down and you don't get a big enough surplus, you're going to have to raise taxes to get the surplus. It's the catch-22. So it's better to keep those reserves. It does the town much more beneficial to it than spending it on an item like this, even though it's a $1 million plus project. Compared to some of the projects that we have to be going through. I believe the study was on the road project a little over $40 million. So, I don't want to use up the borrowing capacity of the town if we have the cash to spend it now. And because of the ARPA funds, we do. Be a different discussion if we didn't have the ARPA funds.
Okay. Well, let's talk more specifically. Well, let's talk generally about the undesignated versus the contingency funds. So let's talk in the hypothetical, and let's talk about some catastrophic emergency where it's going to be genuinely millions of dollars and it has got to get done. Let's say that the bridge at the end of Grove Street that crosses over the Housatonic River, we have an earthquake or something like that, and we get a genuine catastrophic failure and it just collapses into the river. That's something where we're going to need money right now to hurry up and get this turned around. And it's not a state highway. It's a town road. So that's all on us. Yeah. So is that something where, let's say we were not going to bond that. Let's say we were going to say this is a genuine emergency and we got to get it turned around right away. We don't have time to go out and do the bond packaging process. Would that be something that would come out of the contingency fund, or would that be something that would more appropriately come out of the undesignated fund?
I would say the undesignated fund because of the dollar amounts involved. But again, I would recommend using what's needed out of that fund to get the project started. With regard to bridges, there's state money that can become available. It takes a while to get it, but
yeah,
so I wouldn't go out, say it was a $5 million project. I wouldn't spend $5 million right away. I would do what's needed, the engineering fund, stuff along those lines. And depending on the cost, Well, engineering funds would probably deplete the contingency fund or deplete it enough that I would rather go to the undesignated. Again, it depends on the cost, and then you get it going. I mean, that's what it's there for those emergency type uses.
So in that case, from a legal purview standpoint, there really isn't any difference between the funds when it comes to that type of emergency spending.
No, it's really, to my knowledge, it's really just the amount of money in there. I mean, both of them have to be approved by the council and the board of finance. So it's not there. It's just, hey, we know we've got this money in the undesignated. We want to keep that for long term stability, financial stability of the town, and as a place we go for drastic emergencies, which we were, COVID came close to doing that. We didn't know what our tax revenue was going to be with COVID because of so many businesses closing down, people not working and the like. And luckily we were able to go through it with getting reasonable amount of taxes and actually collected over the course of the year, the full amount that we budgeted for. So, but if that didn't happen, yeah, that's where the undesignated could have been used. As I said, the contingency fund is multiple factors lower than the unfounded.
Okay, so you talked about how that might affect bond rating. We're getting kind of late here, so I'm only going to ask one question when it comes to the bond rating. How does the bond rating impact voters?
The better the bond rating, and we've got the second highest rating possible, and the only reason we don't have the highest is we're competing with like Greenwich and Stanford, and they have a higher per capita income than the Milford does. But in terms of record of paying our bills and the like, we have identical records. So we have the second highest rating. That gives us, typically when we go to the bond market to ask for people to lend us the money, we get the lowest or very low interest rate. And actually the last funding round that we did, we got a lower interest rate than towns like Greenwich and Stanford did. So, and that saves interest payments stretched out over 5, 10, 15, 20-year period significantly impacts the taxpayer on how much taxes he pays, because you have to service that debt.
So on to the budget then.
Okay.
And this is another topic that we've beaten to death to such a point that you've already addressed about half of what I've got here in my notes anyways. So let's just touch up on some areas we haven't really talked about, and that pertains specifically, I think, to the chair. First things first, because this actually, I cannot believe it, but it actually has come up. Does the Board of Finance or the chair have any say over the written layout and formatting of the printed copies of the budget?
All right, let's put it this way. The printed copies of the budget that are put in the newspaper, basically all we have is the dollar amounts that go in there. The format is it's something that the town has used for decades, and we're not changing that at all. With regard to the budgetary books that we get one from the Board of Ed, we get one from the mayor. That's in their discretion. So the Board of Finance doesn't have any input on it. I mean, if it's very difficult or whatever to read, I might say something to the mayor, hey, we could approve it this way. Why don't you think about it for the next go round? But no real.
So when it comes to what the voters do. Yeah. So when it comes to what the voters read in the newspaper, let's say, because you touched up on that, does the chair of the Board of Finance or does the Board of Finance have any purview whatsoever over how that gets printed out, over that formatting?
No. That formatting is done by the combination of the paper and historically what we've done. The town has done, I shouldn't say the Board of Finance, but the town has done. And it gets printed twice. First, it gets printed by the town council budget before it comes to us and before the town meeting. So before the town meeting for public commentary, the people have it. Then it gets reprinted again with the adjustments the Board of Finance made, if any, to wherever they have the ability to do that. And then it goes back to the voters. It's republished and the voters can get it. Also, there's, town hall, town clerk, there's copies of the budget there in a little bit. Mainly we keep the format of the paper because that's the easiest for non-financial people that are, not familiar with the whole budgetary process to be able to see.
So there was a topic I told you to put a pin in, and that was the role of the chair during the joint budget hearing process. So as everybody knows, the town council and the Board of Finance meet together, and all of the parties to the budget who are making requests, including the nonprofit organizations that make requests for grants, they all make their presentations, they all build their case, and there's a conversation that happens between the members of the joint boards, the Board of Finance and the town council, between those members and the people presenting. So what is the role of the chair of the Board of Finance in these joint budget hearings?
Well, during the budget hearings, the joint budget hearings, the mayor is the ex officio chairman. He and I sit together. The Board of Finance members, if they have a question, they let me know. Then I let the mayor know, and the mayor calls on them. So to keep that type of an order flow. I think that's pretty much answers your question on that. Other than that, I don't have a role in those joint meetings per se.
Okay, so in that meeting, you serve effectively, besides the open and closure of the meeting, as just a standard member of the board.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So Walter, what are some of the things you look for when reviewing the budget, either during the hearings, before the hearings, after the hearings? What are some things you look for?
Well, I want to look compared to the previous year budget. There's a significant increase, or during the Q&A after the town council makes its decision. Is it consistent with what they've historically done? Because when you do the budgeting process, everybody asks when the budget is being presented more than they actually need, because they know it's going to be adjusted, at least before it goes to the mayor, before it goes to the Board of Ed. And typically the mayor will present what it is. And I've got to look at, this is personally, but this is what I do as a chair. So I look at previous year's budgeting, see what it is. In our discussion, let's say, for example, with the Board of Education, I'll ask them, gee, you're asking for XYZ increase. How much of that is contractual? Like you have no choice, you have to increase it by that amount, or decrease spending elsewhere. And that becomes a difficult decision on the Board of Finance. It's one I like to leave to the town. If I know their increase is mainly contractual. I lost track of what the question was there, Mike. Can you repeat it again? My role in the budget?
No, what are some things you're looking for when you're reviewing the budget?
Yeah, and that's mainly it. Or something that I think is really outrageous, and that may be hyperbole, but, out of ordinary. But again, the Board of Finance only can adjust very gross amounts of, like, say, the personnel budget, whereas the town council could go through individual jobs, and come up with a total. The Board of Finance can only say, personnel, the town council said $1 million. We'll say 950,000. We can't go down in there and say eliminate one patrol officer to save that 50,000. You understand what I'm saying, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that was clear enough.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I look for. And then we have a discussion, deliberation on the budget, taking in all the factors from the town meeting or town hall that I was alluded to before, the Q&As that we had going in before, and then we discuss amending the budget or passing it as is.
So, all right, since we're wrapping things up right before we get into Q&A, next thing we're going to do, folks, is Q&A. So if you've got questions for Walter O'Connor, get them in now, and we'll go into Q&A. Walter, since I've asked basically every member of the Board of Finance this, I'm assuming we can do this in one word since we're just about out of time. Has the Board of Education budget ever been cut?
No.
Fair enough. All right. So, Walter, before we get into Q&A.
It has been increased.
It has been increased.
It has been increased. The town council has decreased it and the Board of Finance has increased it.
So, just as we did at the beginning of the show, Walter, how can people reach and follow you?
The best way to reach me is by email. And I'll say it again, it's all lowercase, Walter, ORN, @gmail.com. The only thing I would request is in the subject line, put Board of Finance, or something close to that, so I know it's not one of the junk mails if I don't recognize the sender. And I've given that out before in other years, and that's the best way to get to me.
So, all right. So we're going to go into the audience commentary here because we don't have any actual questions. MJ Durkin says, thanks for doing the show, Mike. I just want to say thanks so much, everybody, for following in and tuning in throughout the entirety of this process. This is the last interview we're doing. So so everyone who's been watching, everyone who's been asking these tough questions from the audience to our candidates and to our guests, really appreciate everyone who's joined in. It's been a really fun ride and a really fun process for me. I just want to give my thanks to the audience who's stayed with us throughout this entire process. And then MJ also says, and I figured I'd read this out because it's to your credit, Walter. Pete Bass says that Walter has been very instrumental in our town's financial success. So I figured I'd pass that on to you. I kind of agree. So.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor, too, for coming on the show and kicking off this series. So, Walter, thank you so much for coming on to the show and for closing out the series with us.
I appreciate the opportunity, Michael.